Society at the Sustainable Consumption Institute here at Alliance Manchester Business School, Mike Hodson. In this series, we hear from new and newly promoted professors in the business school who are delivering their inaugural lectures. So Mike was promoted to a professorship last summer in recognition, of course, of his considerable achievements, most especially in research. And this is an opportunity for us in the business school and more widely to celebrate his success. So it is great to see colleagues here face to face supporting Mike. Of course, we do actually have quite a substantial online audience from around the globe also joining us today. So Mike will be talking to both audiences, as I am now. And so thank you to everybody for joining at this event, wherever you are in the world. It's really great to have you here. So Mike's research focuses on relationships between urban governance, the shape of future sustainable cities, and transitions in urban infrastructures. He has published and presented widely on this agenda and has been part of a multi-partner research project and networks funded by the European Commission, the ESRC and the EPSRC. In today's lecture, Mike will discuss how digital platforms are being mobilised to reimagine the future of cities. I was just telling Mike and colleagues I've been in the metaverse today, so that might be part of the agenda in the future. But he's interested in, as I say, reimagining the future of cities and how these digital platforms are being used, who is using them and why. Now, there's going to be plenty of time for discussion towards the end of the session for your questions. Those of you in the room can, in the traditional way, raise your hands. And for those of you who are online, we very much want you to participate in the Q&A session as well. So please do type them into the chat function and we will go through them and intersperse both the face-to-face questions and online questions in that session. Now, the discussion and questions today are going to be facilitated by my colleague, Andy McMeekan, who's a Professor of Innovation, also in the Sustainable Consumption Institute here in the Business School. So, like me, I'm sure you're keen to get started. So let me hand over to Professor Hodson to begin the presentation. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you very much, Fiona, for those kind words of introduction. And hello, everybody. It's good to see friends. It's good to see colleagues, old and new, and also one or two people who I've not seen before. So, particular welcome to you as well, and to those of you online. What I want to do, I want to be slightly self-indulgent. If you can't do that in this context, then I'm not sure when you can. So I'm going to speak for around 40 minutes, and I want to make an argument. And I want to make an argument about the future of the city, how urban infrastructure is being mobilised in visions of the future of the city, the social interests who are shaping this, and what the implications of this are. Welcome, that's my son down here, just right. More specifically, what I'd like to do in the lecture is to start by asking a question. And the question that I want to ask is, how are digital platforms, as a form of urban infrastructure, how are digital platforms being mobilised to reimagine the future of cities? Who is doing this and why? On this clicker, is this clicker just that way? Okay, thank you. Now, there's a lot going on in that question. It's quite a busy question. But I think broadly speaking, there are three parts to it. First of all, there's the focus on digital platforms. And the most obvious examples of these that we come across in everyday life are probably ride-hailing platforms. So Uber and Didi Chuxing in China, bike-sharing platforms that are almost ubiquitous across large cities now, and property sharing platforms such as Airbnb. But digital platforms encompass much more than these obvious forms of service. Platform technologies and organisation are intervening in infrastructure systems of provision across wide areas of everyday life, from how we move about, to how we kept warm, how we eat, how we pay for things, how we meet romantic partners, and so on. And so this has become more and more widespread over the last decade or so. But secondly, I think there's the issue of how digital platforms are being used as a means to reimagine and to rethink the city. We live in an era of rapid global urbanisation. The majority of the world's population lives in urban areas now. And across the next century, rapid population growth, even if it's uneven, rapid population growth is projected. And yet urban areas are also contexts where some of the world's most pressing challenges are highly apparent. Questions around how to organise economic activity, how to accomplish decarbonisation, how to address air pollution, how to build social inclusivity, how to address extreme poverty, and so on. And it's in this context that the future organisation of cities has become a pressing concern for policymakers, but also for academics from a range of disciplines. Multiple visions of the future of the city are being produced and constantly circulate. And these visions are informed by deeply held beliefs or imaginaries of how the city and its infrastructure systems and services should be organised. And to take a third point, when we think about reimagining the future of the city and the services and infrastructure systems of the city, this suggests a view that how the future of the city is imagined can in some senses be shaped, or in some way, or in some senses, it's malleable. It asks questions about who it is that's doing this work, who is shaping the way we think about cities of the future, and how are they mobilising innovations in urban infrastructure systems to do so? Is this the job of public institutions? Is it the role of corporations? Is this for NGOs? Or is it about new coalitions of these and other kinds of social interests? Now, I think it's fair to say that constituent parts of this problematic and this focus have begun to be addressed in academic literatures. So there's a growing social science literature on digital platforms. This literature is being developed in numerous disciplinary and interdisciplinary contexts, but often cutting across these different disciplinary and interdisciplinary contexts is that the focus of analysis within them is on the digital platform itself, either statically looking at the digital platform or through processes of platformization and how the platform changes over time. But a rapidly developing body of academic work has been labelled with the conjunction platform urbanism. And this takes a focus not solely on platforms, but in the mutually shaping relationships between digital platforms on the one hand and urban context on the other. And this focus on the ways in which digital platforms and urban contexts mutually shape each other can also be understood in relation to a wider body of work on urban technopolitics, where relationships between technology and urban context are subjected to critical scrutiny. And so the urbanist Andy Carver has pointed out that how and why technologies play a central but often under-acknowledged role in the design and development of cities is rife with political machinations. And so the point is that this is not a technocratic exercise, it's not an administrative exercise, it's deeply political. And thinking about the mutual shaping of infrastructure and urban context in this way has potentially profound implications for how we think about the role of the city in relation to technological innovations. So on the one hand, this literature allows us to think of the city as a site or a location for corporate actors and for others to trial infrastructural technology, with the view, either implicitly or explicitly, that the city is a recipient in some ways of technology. But it also allows us to focus on how place-based interests can begin to think about how they can use infrastructural technology to address urban problems and to reimagine and remake the city in doing so. So this opens up the possibility to think not just reactively about the potential that infrastructural technologies may afford, but to explore the ways in which infrastructure may contribute to the long-term strategic direction of the city and the economic, ecological, and social challenges it may face. In the face of these possibilities and challenges, there are huge questions for policymakers and other urban actors as to how to organise cities of the future. These possibilities and challenges about how to respond and how to respond to them at the level of urban actors need to be understood in a context where urban actors may have variable discretion to be able to shape these responses. So, I think it's increasingly the case that innovation and experimentation with the organisation of urban infrastructure is being positioned as a key strategic concern for urban decision makers. Reimagining infrastructure is repeatedly presented as central to strategies of response to the grand global urban challenges of the future. And we can see this in examples from across a range of international institutions and organisations that includes the United Nations Environment Programme, the UN Habitat Programme, the C40 group of leading world cities, New York, London, Toronto, who are working closely with large corporate organisations, but also at the level of response of individual cities and at national government urban policy. And a question that follows from this that's become a prevalent focus over the last couple of decades for policymakers and for academics is if urban infrastructure is being mobilised as a response to key global urban challenges. Who is it that shapes the strategic organisation of urban infrastructures of the future? So the argument that I've begun to try and make is on the one hand about the strategic centrality of urban infrastructure, to how the future of the city is being reimagined, but on the other hand, also about the politics of possibility in shaping urban infrastructure and the future city. And I want to drill down a little deeper into this argument and to begin to articulate three key categories of debate and literature, which I'm trying to bridge and bring together in some kind of way. First of all, on urban infrastructure, there's been something of an urban infrastructural turn over the last couple of decades or so. And the notion of a turn is a somewhat overused concept these days, but I think it's genuinely the case here because there's been a significant shift in the way that urban infrastructure is understood. And a catalyst for this turn has been the work of the urbanists Steve Graham and Simon Marvin, and particularly their book, Splintering Urbanism, which recast urban infrastructure from the domain of engineers and planners and extended a focus on material infrastructure to a focus on the social and political organisation of urban infrastructure and the ways in which this manifests in the uneven spatial organisation of urban infrastructure. And infrastructure here generally refers to networked energy, transport, water and waste infrastructure. And this approach sees infrastructure not just or even solely as a technological object or an artifact, but as a socio-technology. And so by focusing not just on the wires and the pipes and the ducts and other material elements of infrastructure, it becomes possible to analyse the social and economic forces shaping infrastructure configurations, and how the infrastructures that structure and support urban life prioritize some connections over others, and how this becomes locked in to the physical fabric of the city. And this literature has grown substantially over the last 20 years or so. But secondly, I want to bring these debates about urban infrastructure together with debates around who it is that claims to speak on behalf of the city in thinking about the strategic role of infrastructure. Since the late 1980s, debates on urban governance have taken as their key reference point the work of the geographer David Harvey on urban entrepreneurial governance. And Harvey highlighted the shift from what he called the managerialist form of urban government of services to more entrepreneurial forms of urban governance. In this way of understanding urban governance, new public-private coalitions of social interests would work together entrepreneurially to remake the city, often through reimagining and remaking forms of urban infrastructure. And the most cited example of this is around the plethora of forms of declining industrial dock infrastructures that have been remade as waterfront, residential and employment developments. And you can see this in cities all across the world, including if we were to get on our bikes and ride down to Salford Quays, we'd see it there as well. But urban entrepreneurial governance has also been mobilised through mega events such as Olympic Games, Commonwealth Games, other forms of sporting events and cultural events that have been used as a kind of place branding, but also the ways in which urban governance has mobilised infrastructure, such as new forms of urban light rail system, urban tram infrastructure, as well as urban bike sharing schemes and so on. A strong emphasis in urban entrepreneurial governance approaches has been about making urban context amenable to investment, both private and public, via the stories, via the representations of the city that are produced. But recent debates on urban governance have argued that, to use the words of Jamie Peck, even though there are signs of surface vigour in terms of urban entrepreneurial governance approaches, there are also signs of strategic exhaustion with these approaches to urban governance. Which leads us to a third point, which is to think about how urban infrastructure is mobilised by particular social interests to reimagine the future of the city. And I think there are many ways into this, but my focus here is on how visions of the future represent the future of the city and the role of infrastructure in this. And visions are constructed by a wide range of potential urban actors, by public urban authorities, by consultancies, by corporate business, NGOs, and others, as orientations to the future, symbolic representations of the future, and informing the construction of visions, or what the science and technology studies academic Sheila Jasanoff and others have referred to as socio-technical imaginaries, and what the geographer Josh Watkins has called spatial imaginaries, or in this case, deeply held views about the technological and spatial future of the city. So I want to use these debates to bring them together, to bridge them, to try and explore the question I asked at the start of the lecture. So what I want to do here is to explore in a little bit of detail 2 examples of efforts to strategically use a digital platform to reimagine the city and who the social interests are pursuing this. Now, the category of the urban or urban context in its singularity masks a whole range of varieties. So there's some choices here. We could look at cities in the global north, cities in the global south, could look at rapidly expanding megacities, global cities of the class of New York and London. We could look at what Jennifer Robinson has called ordinary cities, and so on and so forth. But what I want to do here is to focus on 2 former industrial cities in the global north. and more specifically, 2 former industrial cities in the North Atlantic Anglosphere. So the examples I'm going to use are, first of all, of a strategic attempt to build a vision of the future of the city that uses a digital platform to envisage private urban governance of an urban neighbourhood in Toronto. And secondly, I want to talk about a vision of the future of the city that uses a digital platform as a means of trying to, constitute public control of an integrated urban transport system that has the ideal of a single urban space in Greater Manchester. And I'm going to structure these examples in relation to the 3 themes that I discussed a few moments ago, asking questions about how digital platforms are being strategically mobilised in visions of the future of the city, in what ways they're seen as forms of urban infrastructure, and what kinds of social interest and urban governance configurations does this involve. Okay, so let's wind back to 2017. These images are of the Eastern Waterfront area of Toronto. The Eastern Waterfront area is an old industrial and shipping site that, since the decline of industry over the last 60 or 70 years or so, has been the focus of numerous variably successful and unsuccessful regeneration projects. And the consequence is that the site is a mixture of temporary overflow parking lots and also a docks for numerous small cruise and pleasure boats. The majority of the waterfront site is owned by Waterfront Toronto. Waterfront Toronto is an urban development corporation that is publicly funded by 3 tiers of Canadian government. That's the federal government of Canada, the provincial government of Ontario, and the city government of Toronto, with the remit of redeveloping 2,000 acres of brownfield land in the old docks area. And it's in this context that in March of 2017, Waterfront Toronto issued a request for proposals and calls for a funding partner for Toronto's Eastern Waterfront. And its call, in its own language, was to develop an area of the waterfront into what it called a highly sustainable, mixed-use, mixed-income neighbourhood, creating jobs and affordable housing. In October of 2017, the successful bid was announced as being won from Sidewalk Labs. Sidewalk Labs is an affiliate of Alphabet, the parent company of Google, and their proposals were for the development of a 12-acre stretch of Toronto's waterfront in a development that was called the Keysight. And in its vision that Sidewalk Labs developed in October of 2017, whilst the initial focus was on a 12-acre site that you can see hatched in orange on the screen, its wider ambition and vision covered approximately 800 acres of Toronto's waterfront that it saw as potentially available for development. The plans for the Keysight, if they were to be realised, were widely claimed to represent one of the largest examples of a digital smart city project in North America. And the vision was full of attempts to experiment with infrastructural technology across a wide range of infrastructure systems, across energy systems, the built environment, transport systems, and so on, with the aim of this experimentation, in Sidewalk Labs' own words, being to create a replicable model of urban development for the world. So in this vision, new configurations of the built environment, energy and mobility systems were being experimented with, and discursively in the vision, this was bundled together with the idea that this kind of form of infrastructural experimentation and transformation could be used to address sustainability concerns and to tackle what Sidewalk Labs characterised as the thorniest problems in environmental performance. Sidewalk Labs was positioning itself to be a first mover in integrating these kinds of multiple infrastructural innovations with multiple infrastructural systems, but also bringing this together with innovation with a digital platform. Conceptually, Sidewalk Labs talked about innovation in buildings, in mobility systems, in energy systems, heating systems, in green infrastructure, in parks, and so on. And it collectively characterised this as the physical layer. But above the physical layer, Sidewalk Labs envisaged a digital layer. Or in other words, it envisaged innovation that involved building a digital platform infrastructure that was intended to be used as a control system for these other systems. So it's a digital infrastructure of control of a new mobility, energy, water, waste, and other systems. And in the vision, in trying to populate what it meant by a digital layer, Sidewalk Labs talked about embedding within the physical fabric of the city a distributed network of urban sensors. Sensors to monitor air quality, building conditions, parking systems, traffic flows, and so on. And this would generate huge amounts of data. So Sidewalk Labs would collect this location-based data and information about the infrastructure, about the buildings, about the shared public realm. It also suggested through its vision that it would generate data through residents and residents of the neighbourhood accessing public and private services through a personalised portal. And the generation of this data, these multiple sources of data, would be used to simulate what Sidewalk Labs called what-if scenarios for long-term city planning decisions. So Sidewalk Labs were moving into the realm of urban governance. Now, Google Sidewalk Labs invested considerable amounts of time and their reputation in trying to build a digital platform for a future sustainable city. But it begs the question of why would a tech company do this? As I said a moment ago, Keysight appears to be an attempt to constitute a new systemic level digital platform to privately control key urban services. It was reported in 2017 in the New York Times that the words of this guy, this is Eric Schmidt, the guy on the screen. Eric Schmidt was the then executive chairman of Google's parent company, Alphabet. And Schmidt was reported to have said, wouldn't it be nice if you could take technical things that we know and apply them to cities? This kind of view of the city as a test bed. He went on to say that our founders got really excited about this. We started talking about all of these things that we could do if someone would just give us a city and put us in charge. Later in the article, Schmidt acknowledged that it doesn't work that way, but there's something quite telling about the words that he used. So, from our analysis, that's myself and Andy McMeekin, we've collaborated closely on this agenda over the last few years. We've highlighted two reasons in particular that we think Google were interested in developing a digital platform for a sustainable city. The first is the issue I mentioned a moment ago about developing a digital platform in the city as a way of moving towards gaining greater private control of how the city is governed. Sidewalk Labs, in its own language, proposed 5 what it called management entities that would take on responsibilities outside the jurisdiction of existing public agencies. And it talked about piloting and administering novel infrastructural systems. So I think in short, this represents an experiment with new forms of private urban governance at neighbourhood level. As one of our interviewees told us, a leading Ontario-based tech entrepreneur, the model really is one where Google takes control or seeks to take control of the city's digital nervous system. And if they do that, they control who and what they interact with. But I think secondly, this was about far more than urban governance in Toronto for Google. Going back to the point that was made by Sidewalk Labs in its vision documents, they talked about successful realization of the vision being intended to create a replicable model for the world. In this respect, I think in Toronto, Sidewalk was experimenting with building a digital platform, not just the technical side of things, but the social side of things and the social organization of this. What were some of the governance issues that were coming up? What was the public pushback? What forms of knowledge and know-how would be generated through this process? And it was that, I think, that was intended to be replicated in terms of a model. However, this never moved beyond the vision stage, really. In May of 2020, the Sidewalk Labs CEO, Dan Doctorow, published a letter where he said that Sidewalk would no longer be pursuing development in Toronto due to unprecedented economic uncertainty. This was the time of the beginning of the pandemic. He also talked about uncertainty in the Toronto real estate market and the size of the 12-acre project being financially unviable. That's the kind of Sidewalk position. Critics of the Sidewalk position argue that this provided convenient cover for a unilateral withdrawal from Sidewalk Labs. Okay, and I want to take a second, very different example of how a digital platform has been synthesized with a long-term and evolving vision to integrate urban public transport. And within this, attempts to reassert public control over a fragmented urban public transport system. This example is much closer to home than Toronto. Some of you might remember that in Greater Manchester in 1986, the then Thatcher government at the time abolished the Greater Manchester County Council and liberalised and deregulated Greater Manchester's buses. Subsequent to this, in 1992, the first line on the Metrolink light rail network began operating. And in 1994, the UK major government began privatisation of the UK rail network. What this meant was, in short, that in the 1990s, Greater Manchester had a very fragmented public transport system, or to use the words of the concepts of Graham and Marvin, a splintered public transport system. And although Greater Manchester-wide formal governance of public transport networks continued from this time, there was limited place-based capacity to shape that system. Since the fragmentation of public transport in the 1990s, we've seen a public transport authority vision in Greater Manchester of the desirability of a reintegrated public transport system. This vision has slowly evolved over 2 decades or so. And we can track it historically through analysis of statutory local transport plans. So the 2006 second statutory local transport plan in Greater Manchester set out that amongst its main challenges was to take further steps to encourage integration between transport modes. Subsequently, in 2011, the third local transport plan recognised the full benefits of digital smart ticketing, and it referred to the success of London's Oyster card scheme. But it recognised that even though the technology was there, the tech was there, the social context, the systemic transport context in Manchester was problematic due to its splintered, fragmented nature. The 2017 plan and its 2021 refresh said we will stop viewing different modes of transport as separate networks. So over the course of over a decade, we've moved from in 2006, talking about taking further steps to encourage integration, to in 2011, saying, look, the tech's there, but the systemic context is problematic. And in 2017, saying, look, we're going to stop viewing different modes of transport as separate networks, with individual asset management, service planning, fares operating at the level of particular operators and so on. And instead, we're going to plan a single highly connected transport system that customers can move through. So, but central to the vision of public transport integration in Greater Manchester has been efforts to constitute a digital ticketing platform, coordinating between multiple transport systems and giving the ability for passengers and users to navigate between systems. But as I mentioned a moment ago, the technological possibility has met with this fragmented social and systemic transport system context. You can see, if you look at the slide, from the selective and stylized timeline that captures this, the efforts to develop a smart ticketing platform, a digital ticketing platform in Greater Manchester, over time, can helpfully be understood by seeing it as a form of incremental infrastructure. It's constantly in the process of becoming. And this is a process that spans more than a decade in this instance. From an initial pilot project in Bolton to the announcement of the smart digital travel card in 2012, delays to the development, a cancelled contract with the platform's developer, recognition that smart card technology was likely to be superseded by contactless payments, mobile apps on smartphones and so on. We then got relaunches of the digital smart card. But I think what's important here in particular is the key role of two actors in particular in shaping these incremental developments. First of all, national state interests, particularly the Department for Transport as funders and regulators, but also from 2017, the new role of the Mayor of Greater Manchester and the Mayor's work to intensify pre-existing efforts to integrate the transport system. So what we see, I think, is an evolving vision and the incremental development of a digital ticketing platform. This was initially envisioned narrowly as a digital smart card ticketing platform, subsequently broadened out to take account of other forms of contactless and app-based payments. And in the latest iteration, we've got the concept of a singular transport system for Greater Manchester that incorporates the ability to have a system of fares that operates at that system level. But it's an incremental infrastructure. It's always in the process of becoming. In many ways, the evolving vision of reintegration and the incremental role of a digital platform within this can be understood through governance tensions and approaches in Greater Manchester. I think in particular, following the abolition of the County Council in '86, metropolitan scale transport governance persisted. It was there. But at the same time, simultaneously, through the 1990s, there was the emergence of a new approach to urban governance in Greater Manchester that resonated with many of David Harvey's themes on entrepreneurial governance. The tension was one between the prioritisation of transport infrastructure projects to connect to key strategic growth sites, on the one hand, so connecting to the city centre, the airport, the Trafford Centre, Salford Quays and so on, alongside the challenges of maintaining a city regional-wide network of services in a context of austerity and large-scale reductions in operating budgets. But I think this example also flags up the limits when we talk about urban actors. It flags up the limits to place-based discretion in terms of the way in which Greater Manchester's priorities have been conditioned by a strong national state. Okay, I want to return to the question that I started the lecture with, which is how are digital platforms being mobilised to reimagine the future of cities? Who's doing it and why? And these are clearly two very particular examples, focusing on Toronto and on Greater Manchester. But I think there are the beginnings of a wider resonance here. These two examples illustrate in very different ways in which digital platforms, as forms of urban infrastructure, are being mobilised in visions of the future of the city. I've tried to illustrate that although we talk about a digital platform nominally in the singular, they can actually be socially organised and strategically oriented in very different ways, involving different social interests, motivations, and imaginaries of the future of the city. These are likely to be two of multiple visions involved in the struggle for the future of the city. I think these examples also illustrate the ways in which digital platforms can be seen as an integrative form of urban infrastructure, one that tries to hybridize digital innovation with more conventional forms of urban infrastructure. Whether this represents an efforts to move from the splintering urbanism of Graham and Marvin to new forms of private and public integration by the use of digital platforms, or whether what we're going to see is actually another round, a new round of splintering, I think remains an open question. In terms of urban governance, we have examples where, on the one hand, the platform is the locus of corporate attempts to privately control new infrastructural modes in the city. And another example where the platform is the ongoing basis and symbol of attempts to try and reintegrate fragmented urban transport modes under public control. These clearly represent very different visions of governing the future of the city, within which digital platforms play a key coordinating role. Both of the examples, both of the efforts to represent and subsequently realise digital platforms at urban scale can be seen as a long-term process of struggle. We saw a process of 3 years in Toronto before the plug was pulled, and arguably well over a decade in Greater Manchester. It's important to understand urban platformisation as a process that develops over time. It's a process of becoming, and in that it's a process of struggle, it's a process of constraint, and it's a process of possibility. But it's one where, in the two examples that I've given, there is limited tangible realisation, and where relationships between public and private interests are in tension, where there are governance struggles between multiple public and private interests, often with very different aims and motivations, which raises questions about how public and private interests cooperate in governing the future of the city through digital platforms. In short, what I've tried to do is to argue and demonstrate there is a central role, but a differential ability for social interests to mobilise digital platforms in their visions of making the future of the city. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mike. That was a fascinating lecture. You promised us 40 minutes. You gave us 40 minutes, bang on time. I particularly obviously like the, it's nice to remember those field trips in Toronto, actually, because it reminds you that the research process sometimes in textbooks looks like a bunch of formal interviews, but the reality, the social reality of doing interviews and field work is a lot messier. And we had some quite interesting adventures when we were doing that. But including spending a lot of time just talking in coffee shops about how to make sense of the case, actually. But
yeah,
there you go. It's great.
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, just to pick up on the point, I think you're right. There's something really quite important that does get left out of the methods textbooks, which is the kind of informal interactions that those kind of field trips allow. And, you know, they're just something that often gets lost in the kind of contemporary university, which is the kind of space, the space to think, the space to talk, the space to reflect, you know, operating at a kind of different temporal rhythm, which is kind of what those trips did, and it's kind of quite productive in that sense.
Anyway, we shouldn't be too self-indulgent. So I've obviously got lots of questions, but what I'll do is to first of all go to the room for a couple of questions. I've always got one if not, and then perhaps we'll see if there's anything online in a few minutes. So online audience, please take the opportunity to put your questions into the chat room as well.
So that was really fascinating, Mike. Gerard Hodgkinson, here from the Business School, Professor of Strategic Management and Behavioural Science. I tend to look at these things very differently from a psychological perspective. And I'm just kind of taken with the idea that technologies provide affordances. So you've got a time cycling dynamic to this. In particular areas, technologies will become enablers of agentic intervention. So, you know, the rise of digital platforms has done that to some extent, and different actors will try and appropriate them to their own socio-political ends. At other times, though, physical artifacts, including technologies, become constraining. They shape the way we frame things. And somewhere lurking in there as well, we have to never lose sight of the fact that people become emotionally as well as cognitively attached to certain ways of living and certain artifacts. So just I'm taken by the difference between the image of that absolute dump where in Toronto they've developed, and the Manchester context, which is very different, which is full of iconic buildings, and the technologies that you're talking about there connect together in a way that enables and knits communities. Whereas I think large sections of Toronto wouldn't care about that armpit, if I can use that term, for a northern expression. So I just welcome your reflections on that.
It's interesting to talking about it as the armpit, because in many ways it's probably amongst the kind of most valuable real estate that's kicking about. You know, they've spent 60 or 70 years trying to regenerate that waterfront, and they've had various forms of organisational and institutional kind of transformations to try and do that, including, you know, I mean, the lead up. The lead up to the Keysight project in Toronto, the 2017 request for proposals, there'd been the best part of 16, 17 years establishing waterfront Toronto. It was operating on a more conventional kind of Harvey-esque public-private kind of models. It was about condos on the waterfront, you know, apartments, those kinds of issues. But there's something quite interesting about, you know, we can think about all these big issues, but in that case, there was a change in leadership at the top of Waterfront Toronto. There's the founding director of Waterfront Toronto has kind of left and was replaced by a new guy from Silicon Valley, who kind of started to think quite differently about urban regeneration, started to think about the role of tech in urban regeneration. And, you know, the wider context here is that when Andy and I first went to Toronto, we were interviewing all sorts of people, you know, philanthropists, people from Waterfront Toronto, people from Sidewalk Labs, activists, journalists, and so on. I mean, apart from the Sidewalk Labs people, everybody we talked to started talking about this thing, the Yellow Book. And what's the Yellow Book? And they said, well, it's Sidewalk Labs is a kind of blueprint for the future of cities. Have you seen it? No. Everybody, have you seen it? No. And nobody had seen this thing. But it took on this kind of mythical status, you know. And it was only kind of, so there was one, I think there was one person who'd kind of seen it, and they kind of dealt with it like a hot potato. They kind of thought, this is not to be cited, and then kind of went, okay. You know, so part of the research that we were doing was actually to try and understand, to dig about a little bit about this Yellow Book, this kind of sense of how the corporation was seeing the future of the city. It was 437 pages long. It was a 437-page book that envisaged the city as essentially a private city, private roads, private schools. You know, depending on who you believe, because this was all leaked, and there's bits of things that we picked up from interviews, even a private judicial system. So that was one claim that was coming out of there. And so, you know, there's quite clearly a particular view developed, and the aim was then to try and translate that through experimentation in Toronto, which kind of could have been anywhere in some senses. I mean, I think they'd looked at 57 different cities before they rocked up in Toronto. But the place-based interests kind of got, you know, they were kind of quite marginalised in that process at that time, because the public agency was led by a tech guy from Silicon Valley. But over time, the process over time was that there was quite a strong public pushback about that. There was a kind of reassertion of the public ethos through Waterfront Toronto. And I think there's something quite, I mean, and therefore you end up with the armpit remaining an armpit, or whatever the characterization is, because the vision remains a vision. It just doesn't become enacted, because I don't think there's enough recognition of the social, you know, the urban context within there, that actually the kind of transformation that's required, although it looks quite sexy and whatever in the vision documents to have the kind of technological artifacts, it's actually the messy realities of the urban context that need to be transformed and reconfigured.
Ooh, quite a few questions here. Can we have like, let's do one more from here, because have we got any online as well? We'll have to try and negotiate this. Quick questions and quicker answers.
So
we can. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yes, just quickly. In regards to platform, what are your thoughts about the so-called gig economy? Well, you know, obviously cities would grow where the jobs are, and like be an armpit and so on, depends on where people would go to earn a living. But now that I'm from Indonesia, we are looking at moving our capitals. We're using ways to control the traffics within our congested Jakarta city. But also we are looking at the implication of this gig economy, where people doesn't have to be living in places where there's so packed and crowded. So what are the implications?
Yeah, I'll try and give a quick answer. We did some work. We've done some work. We've got a big ESRC project that looks at digital platforms and the future of urban mobility. And as part of that, we just got the money for that project, and then COVID struck. So we thought we can't not engage with COVID. Now, what was interesting during the COVID times was the ways in which particular form of platforms became prevalent, particularly Zoom and Teams and those kinds of platforms. But we were looking at mobility, but actually what became apparent was that a lot of non-mobility platforms were having quite substantial implications for mobility. But that was generally for a particular class of people, you know, who could work at home, who could kind of consume at home, and those kind of things. That started to generate new forms of mobility patterns through the kind of the gig economy that you talked about. The kinds of people who are coming around with your Deliveroo, you know, bringing your burger while you're watching Netflix home, and those kinds of issues. So I think, you know, that's just a kind of general point that I think, you know, it's quite complicated. But I think new kind of mobility circulations in this case are opening up that have got quite important implications for the gig economy and in terms of supporting this kind of new economy.
Maybe work from home is what I was referring to. I guess I was using the wrong word.
Yeah,
work from home. Yeah, we'll continue.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go to the online for.
Yeah. So a question from Jeff. He says a key to this appears to be one of societal trust in technology and how personal data is used. What's your take on that? So will a lack of trust retard progress? You know, what are the benefits that could be realised by communities of that?
There's quite a lot of stuff actually from I remember in the Toronto case around. I mean, the surveillance thing maybe was actually it's important, you know, important the privacy issues alongside those, but and then it's not clear that was actually the biggest problem in the Toronto case after all. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the thing is that in that Toronto case, there's those multiple infrastructure systems that were kind of in some way or other were surveilling the population, were surveilling the physical environment in the city, and we're generating huge amounts of data I think you're right. I don't think it was the primary issue in Toronto, but what became quite important was that Sidewalk Labs were generating all this kind of data on everyday activities in the city. They were owning it, they were controlling it, or that was their vision, that was their aspiration initially. But there was a huge amount of public pushback from that through town hall meetings, round tables, they kind of tried to work with that through a visitor centre. None of this kind of stuff seemed to work because there was a massive pushback on this, and part of the fudge was that they were going to have an independent data trust that managed and controlled the data. But that kind of it was a fudge because it kind of left open the question: well, if Sidewalk Labs' proprietary systems are generating this data and they know how this data is being generated, how many different kinds of social interests are going to be able to manipulate and to use this data subsequently? So it's about ownership, control, and about the oversight and the use of data as well. So it's quite a complicated package.
Cool question, man. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just you talked about examples where it's worked to varying degrees, but which cities are getting this right?
Good question. I mean, I guess it depends on what you think right means, and I think that kind of tension for me is between the kind of place-based interests. You've had this kind of push. The Greater Manchester example was about trying to understand something about how place-based interests are trying to push a territorial agenda. There's ambitions in Greater Manchester. We want an integrated public transport. So that's the public position in Greater Manchester. But the problem is that the social context is private, and a private transport system that's largely fragmented. On the other side in Toronto, we've got the vision, we've got the understanding of the tech, we've got the private interest, but the social context is problematic. And I think there's kind of something that needs to be better understood about what an effective set of relationships, institutional relationships between public and private would look like in relation to digital platforms. And I don't think it's particularly well developed.
I mean, I took that to be a really important part of what you're talking about, actually, which is the sense there might be a shift. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that, the newspapers were full of the Uberization of everything. Every day you'd read articles about huge amounts of venture capital going to micro mobilities and all of these different mobility platforms. And yet, more recently, there seems to have been a reassertion. This is your story, I think, reassertion of coordination, maybe strategic coordination by public authorities, which I think you're saying is strategically necessary to actually bring the parts together.
It's strategically necessary, but I also think there's a point about temporal framing. If we just looked at Uber, or if we just looked at a particular point in time, we'd get a very different story. What this argument's about is trying to look across a long time sweep, so you can see the spikes and the ups and the downs and the peaks and the troughs, and the negotiations and the struggles that kind of go on over time, and you get a very different kind of analysis than if especially if you're looking at the scale of the city, and you're not just looking at Uber in Manchester or Uber in London. You start to say, actually, what does the kind of landscape, what does the ecosystem of a multiplicity of platforms look like across the city? You get a very different story then.
Yeah. Can we sneak in a cotton wool from the floor? Yeah, why not? Okay, we've got so one from over there. The reason why I'm not giving it to you two is that you have many opportunities to ask Mike about these questions. But let's have one from the back corner, please.
Me?
Yes. Oh, I didn't see. Can't see.
Sorry, but you said there are sort of visions remain in a vision, and I wonder to what extent this is due to the scale of the vision. So you mentioned the Toronto case. There was a quote there you had about the acreage, and it's no longer viable at that scale. So I think with Manchester as well, you've got a case where you're trying now to interconnect the transport network at a particular scale of a particular moment. So I wonder to what extent maybe you could reflect on that, the sort of changing nature of problems in reference to scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something interesting about visions and about the kind of epistemological question about how do you know the future of cities. And so I don't think they're prescriptions. I don't think they're attempts to kind of say, look, this is what the future of the city is going to look like necessarily. I think they're kind of attempts at persuasion. They're attempts at building legitimacy, attempts at mobilising social interests, and also leveraging money, leveraging investment, and those kinds of issues. And so I think, you know, inevitably they will kind of change over time as a response to, you know, where the money is, or what the contemporary kind of challenges and the issues are. Which again is why I think it's important to look at the evolving nature of visions rather than to take a snapshot of a vision, because you get a very different kind of story by doing that. You know, and the other side of this is, I think the vision stuff kind of speaks to the David Harvey stuff said about interurban competition and how cities compete with each other and the kind of stories they tell about each other. So inevitably, vision, I mean, no visions are going to say, well, we're going to do a bit more of the same, or, you know, or we're going to just have a bit of, you know, we're just going to tick over. They're going to be kind of inflate these things, you know, and it's going to, you know, it's going to be, and so you get this kind of gap between the aspirations, between the rhetoric, and between what's, you know, especially given the complexity of, or the obduracy of the city, between what's realisable.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mike. I think we should probably draw it to a close. We can have conversations afterwards over a nice drink for those who are in the room as well. So thank you very much. I'm handing over to Fiona.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Mike. My head is spinning, so I'm going to have to talk to you over that drink about a couple of your two examples, but really fascinating. And I think I would want to press you though on, could you identify something that works? We're very good as social scientists about kind of understanding all the complexities of things, but then what is interesting is where is something that's working and working well according to your analysis? Because I did sit there at some point and was thinking, there's an undercurrent where you're saying there's a problem with what's happening in Manchester, and I'm sitting there thinking, what's the problem with trying to have an integrated system? Okay, there's a wide context, and I might be missing a million things there in terms of your case, but I'm sitting there thinking, what's the problem? So you'll have to have a drink on that one. But thank you very much, Mike. You know, obviously lots of questions here. Sure, there were plenty more online. We will use the opportunity to perhaps get you to do a bit of a blog to feed so that you can answer those questions. So we'll be looking for lots of other platforms for you to continue the discussion. So thank you everybody for the contributions tonight. Can I just flag our next vital topic is actually on exporting and the UK economy, which is next Thursday, the 5th of May. And our speaker is Marion Sudbury, who's Director of the Regions for the Department for International Trade, and very interestingly, a former MBA student of ours and on our advisory board. And she's going to be joined by the business school's Mario Kaforis, who's Professor of International Business and Innovation, and also Head of People Management and Organisations division within the business school. So registration details, I think, are going to go into the chat function now. There'll be the standard ways of people being able to join the event and so on. But can I just thank everybody for coming along and contributing to the discussion. Thank especially to Mike for a really interesting and engaging presentation. As I say, he'll probably be putting me right on quite a few things in 5 minutes time from now. But can I also take the opportunity to thank Andy as well for facilitating the discussion. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. That's